I signed that prenup with tears streaming down my face, thinking I was protecting Marcus from my broke family. His mother Victoria watched me sign it with this satisfied smile. But 3 months later, when my father's attorney called about my inheritance, that smile disappeared real quick. My name is Aaliyah Parker, and I was a 27-year-old third-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary when I fell in love with Marcus Sterling, an investment banker from one of Chicago's most powerful families. His mother, Victoria, a former federal judge, demanded a brutal prenuptial agreement that would leave me with absolutely nothing. Marcus sat there silent while I signed away any claim to their wealth, desperate to prove I wasn't the gold digger they thought I was. What they didn't know was that my quiet father David, who drove a 15-year-old Honda and lived in a tiny apartment, had been secretly protecting me from a truth that would make their family fortune look like pocket change. And when that truth came out, it didn't just change my life, it destroyed everything they thought they knew about power. Before we dive into this story that changed my entire world, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of what happened when I discovered who I really was. You know how they say love is blind? Well, I learned the hard way that sometimes it's not love that's blind. It's us. It all started 18 months ago when I was grading papers at Cafe Luna on Michigan Avenue, my usual Tuesday afternoon ritual after another long day at Roosevelt Elementary. Teaching third grade in Bronzeville wasn't just a job for me, it was a calling. Every morning I'd wake up in my tiny studio apartment on 47th Street, make coffee in my second-hand Mr. Coffee machine, and drive my 2010 Honda Civic to a school that most people from the North Side would consider challenging. But those people had never seen Jamal's face light up when he finally mastered long division, or watched Maria discover she could read an entire chapter book on her own. That Tuesday afternoon in October, I was sitting at my favorite corner table, my red pen moving across a stack of spelling tests, when this genuine warm laugh made me look up from definitely spelled 6 different creative ways. A man at the table across from me was reading something on his phone, shaking his head with this smile that just drew me in like gravity. He was beautiful in that understated way that takes a moment to fully appreciate. Deep brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Everything about him suggested money, but not in that flashy, desperate way. This was quiet wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. "Sorry," he said, noticing me staring. "My buddy just sent me what might be the worst dad joke in recorded human history. I'm talking criminally bad." His voice had this warm quality that made even strangers feel like old friends. I found myself smiling before I could stop myself. "That bad, huh?" I said, closing my red pen. "Now I'm curious. Trust me, you don't want to know. It would permanently damage your faith in humanity's capacity for humor." He had this way of talking that was both playful and intelligent, like he was always thinking 3 steps ahead, but never made you feel like you were behind. When he stood up and walked over to my table, I noticed he moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about being unwanted anywhere. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "Earlier," I replied, and that handshake lasted just a moment longer than it should have, sending little electric shocks up my arm. "Mind if I sit?" "I promise not to share the dad joke unless you specifically request psychological trauma." For the next 3 hours, we talked like we'd known each other for years. Marcus told me he was an investment banker at Sterling and Associates downtown, one of those firms that managed money for Chicago's elite. But he didn't act like the finance guys you see in movies, all ego and aggressive handshakes. He asked about my students with genuine curiosity, laughed at my stories about 8-year-old playground politics, and seemed fascinated by my world in a way that felt real. When I mentioned Roosevelt Elementary, he didn't get that uncomfortable look most wealthy people got when I talked about teaching in the South Side. Instead, he leaned forward with interest. "That's in Bronzeville, right? I've read about some of the amazing community programs happening in that area. You must have incredible kids there." Most people from his world would have made some comment about giving back or those poor children. But Marcus wanted to hear about Jamal's superhero drawings, Maria's poetry, and the way third graders could turn anything into a mathematical word problem if you challenged them right. "What's the best part about teaching?" he asked as the cafe started filling with the evening crowd. I thought for a moment, watching him actually wait for my answer instead of formulating his next question. Watching them discover they're capable of more than they thought possible. Most of these kids have been told they're behind, or struggling, or disadvantaged. But when they realize they can master something that seemed impossible last week, their whole perspective shifts. They start believing in themselves. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see something shift in his expression. That's beautiful, Alia, really beautiful. As we gathered our things, I found myself not wanting this conversation to end. There was something about Marcus that felt different, not just the obvious attraction, but a genuine kindness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than surface charm. "Would you maybe want to continue this conversation over dinner sometime?" he asked, and I could have sworn I saw nervousness flicker across his face. "I'd love that," I said, and meant it completely. Walking to my car that evening, I couldn't stop smiling. But what I didn't know then was that Marcus was already falling in love with an idea of me. The inspiring teacher who needed someone like him to lift her up, to save her from a world he saw as smaller than his own. But what happened over the next 8 months would show me there's a dangerous difference between being loved and being rescued. For the next 8 months, Marcus and I were inseparable in the most wonderful and suffocating way possible. He'd pick me up after school in his gleaming black BMW, arriving just as I was locking up my classroom with arms full of papers to grade and lesson plans to prepare. Those afternoon drives became my favorite part of each day. Marcus genuinely interested in hearing about my students' progress, remembering their names and asking follow-up questions about their individual challenges. I loved watching him on weekends, when he'd roll up the sleeves of his expensive shirts to help me create bulletin boards for my classroom. He'd study each piece of student artwork with the same serious attention he probably gave to financial portfolios, asking about the stories behind Jamal's elaborate superhero comics and Maria's detailed castle drawings. "This kid's got serious architectural instincts," he'd say, carefully tacking up Maria's latest creation. "Look at how she's thinking about proportion and space." During lunch breaks, Marcus would appear at Roosevelt Elementary with coffee from that expensive place near his office, sitting in my tiny classroom while I scarfed down a sandwich between parent phone calls and lesson planning. He'd ask thoughtful questions about my teaching methods, nod seriously when I explained my philosophy about meeting kids where they are rather than where they're supposed to be. But even then, there were signs I chose to ignore because I was so desperately in love with this version of our relationship. When I suggested we grab dinner at Pearl's Place, my favorite soul food restaurant on 75th Street, where Ms. Pearl had been serving the best catfish in Chicago for 30 years, Marcus would get this slightly uncomfortable expression. "You know what? I just discovered this amazing new place in River North," he'd say with that apologetic smile that made forgiveness feel automatic. "Farm to table, incredible reviews. I think you'd really love it." The restaurants Marcus chose were always beautiful. White tablecloths, extensive wine lists, servers who knew him by name. Places where the bill for one dinner could have fed my entire class lunch for a week. I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just excited to share his world with me, but part of me wondered if he was embarrassed by mine. When my teacher friends invited us to happy hour at Murphy's Pub, where we'd gather every Friday to decompress from the week over cheap beer and even cheaper nachos, Marcus always had work events or family obligations that couldn't be moved. "Rain check?" he'd ask, kissing my forehead with genuine regret. "I promise we'll make it next time." But next time never came. After 6 months of dating, Marcus had never met my friends, never been to my neighborhood except to pick me up, never experienced any part of my world that wasn't carefully curated and comfortable for him. I started changing little things about myself without consciously realizing it. When Marcus complimented a dress I wore to one of his work events, I found myself gravitating towards similar styles, leaving my more colorful, comfortable clothes hanging unworn in my closet. When he mentioned how much he loved my hair when I wore it straightened, I started spending money I didn't have at the salon every 2 weeks. The most telling moment came when Marcus suggested I apply for a position at Lincoln Park Academy, an elite private school where the children of Chicago's wealthy families received the kind of education my Roosevelt kids deserved, but would never get. "The pay is almost double what you're making now," he said, pulling up the job listing on his laptop. "And think about the resources you'd have. Unlimited supplies, small class sizes, parents who are really involved in their kids' education. I love my kids at Roosevelt, I said carefully. They need good teachers. So of course they do. But Aaliyah, you could have such a bigger impact at a place like Lincoln Park. You could really make a difference. As if I wasn't already making a difference. As if the progress Jamal had made in reading, or the confidence Maria had gained in math, or the way shy little Kevin had started participating in class discussions somehow counted less because they happened in a school without marble hallways and endowment funds. But Marcus said it with such genuine conviction, such obvious care for my professional development, that I found myself considering it. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was limiting myself by staying at Roosevelt. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly Marcus was executing a rescue fantasy. He didn't even realize he was living. He genuinely loved me, but he loved the version of me that needed saving, that needed lifting up to his level. He couldn't see that maybe I didn't need rescuing. Maybe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But then Marcus took me to meet his family, and I learned that his desire to save me was nothing compared to their need to destroy me. The first dinner at the Sterling Mansion was like stepping through a portal into a different universe, one where I was clearly an unwelcome alien. Their house in Winnetka wasn't just big, it was a statement of power, all limestone and manicured gardens, with a circular driveway that could have fit 6 of my Honda Civic with room to spare. As we pulled up to the front entrance, I smoothed my best dress, a navy blue sheath I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack specifically for this occasion, and tried to calm the nervous energy that had been building all week. Marcus had been unusually quiet during the 40-minute drive from the city, his hands tense on the steering wheel. "They're going to love you," he said for the 3rd time, but something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Just be yourself. The irony of that advice would become clear soon enough. The heavy wooden door opened before we could knock, revealing Victoria Sterling in all her intimidating glory. She was tall and elegant in that way that money can perfect. Silver hair pulled back in a flawless chignon, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and jewelry that caught the light like it was performing for an audience. Her smile was warm but calculated, like a judge weighing evidence before delivering a verdict. "So you're the teacher Marcus has been telling us about," she said, and the way she pronounced teacher made it sound like charity case. Victoria's handshake was firm and brief, designed to establish dominance without being obvious about it. Her eyes took in every detail of my appearance, my sale rack dress, my modest jewelry, my nervousness, and I could practically see her mental filing system categorizing me under temporary problem to be managed. The inside of the Sterling house was even more overwhelming than the exterior. Marble floors that reflected every sound, oil paintings that belonged in museums, and furniture that looked like it had been inherited from European royalty. Everything was designed to make visitors feel small and temporary. Richard Sterling emerged from what I assumed was his study, and he was the physical opposite of his wife, shorter, rounder, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Where Victoria projected authority through intimidation, Richard seemed genuinely pleased to meet me. "Aaliyah," he said, shaking my hand with actual warmth. "Marcus has told us so much about your work at Roosevelt Elementary. That must be incredibly rewarding." For a moment I felt hopeful, but then I caught Victoria's slight eye roll at her husband's enthusiasm, and I realized that Richard's kindness might be real, but it wouldn't be protective. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have hosted a small wedding. The table was set with china that looked like it belonged in a museum, crystal glasses that sang when you touched them, and enough silverware to suggest multiple courses I wasn't prepared for. Throughout the meal, Victoria maintained a steady stream of subtle attacks, disguised as polite conversation. Each comment was carefully crafted to remind me of my place while maintaining plausible deniability. "Teaching must be so fulfilling spiritually," she said, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. "I imagine the hours are wonderful, even if the compensation isn't quite what you'd find in other professions." "Mom," Marcus warned softly, but his tone suggested this was a familiar dance rather than genuine surprise. "Oh, I don't mean anything negative by it, darling. I have tremendous respect for educators. It's just that we all make different choices about how to build our lives, don't we?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but kept my voice steady. "I love what I do. Money isn't the most important thing. Victoria's smile sharpened like a blade. Of course not, dear. Though it does provide options, doesn't it? Stability, security, the ability to take care of oneself and one's family. Richard stepped in smoothly, clearly practiced at managing his wife's more aggressive moments. Aaliyah, Marcus mentioned you grew up on the South Side. That must have given you a unique perspective on urban education. My father raised me there after my mother died when I was 5, I said. He taught me that education is the most powerful tool for changing your circumstances. And what does your father do? Victoria asked, her fork pausing mid-air with theatrical interest. He works in technology consulting, I said, using the vague description Dad had always given when people asked about his work. Nothing too exciting. What I didn't know was that Victoria was already building a complete profile in her head. Single father in a modest neighborhood, daughter who became a teacher instead of pursuing something more lucrative. She was constructing a narrative that would justify everything that came next. The most telling moment came when Marcus walked me through their art collection after dinner while his parents had coffee in the sitting room. The hallway was lined with original paintings, each one probably worth more than I'd make in 5 years of teaching. Your parents seem... I searched for the right word. They just need time to get to know you, Marcus said, stopping in front of a landscape that looked suspiciously like a Monet. My mom's always been protective. When my dad first started making serious money, people tried to take advantage. She's learned to be cautious. Cautious of what? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. People who might not have the best intentions. I should have asked what he meant. I should have demanded to know if he was questioning my intentions. But I was so desperate to make this work, to prove I belonged in his world, that I just nodded and smiled like his mother's suspicions were perfectly reasonable. Because 3 weeks later, when Marcus proposed in the most romantic way possible, I learned exactly what Victoria Sterling meant by being cautious. The proposal happened on a crisp Saturday morning in November at Millennium Park, right beside the bean sculpture, where we'd had our second official date 8 months earlier. Marcus had been unusually nervous all week, fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket whenever he thought I wasn't looking, taking mysterious phone calls that he'd cut short when I entered the room. I'd started to wonder if he was having second thoughts about our relationship. The dinner with his parents had been 2 weeks earlier, and while Marcus insisted it had gone well, I could feel a subtle shift in his behavior. He was more distant, more careful about what he said, like he was constantly editing himself. But that Saturday morning, as we walked through the park with coffee from our favorite cafe, Marcus suddenly stopped in front of the bean's reflective surface. The early morning light was hitting the sculpture perfectly, creating these amazing distorted reflections of the Chicago skyline, and for a moment, everything felt magical and possible. "Aaliyah," he said, and his voice had this quality I'd never heard before, nervous but determined, like he was about to jump off a cliff and wasn't sure if he could fly. When he dropped to one knee right there on the cold concrete, pulling out a ring box that caught the morning light like it was made of captured stars, I felt my entire world shift on its axis. "Aaliyah Parker," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've changed my entire world. You've made me want to be better, to see things differently, to build something beautiful and lasting. Will you marry me?" The ring was absolutely stunning, a classic solitaire that sparkled like it had captured pieces of the sun, set in platinum with small diamonds along the band. It was elegant and timeless, and probably cost more than I made in 8 months, but all I could think about was building a life with this man who'd brought so much joy and possibility into my world. Through happy tears that felt like they came from somewhere deeper than emotion, I said yes. Yes to love, yes to partnership, yes to the future we'd been building together, one conversation at a time. For 30 beautiful seconds, as Marcus slipped that ring onto my finger and kissed me with the kind of passion that makes strangers stop and smile, I thought I was living in a fairy tale. The ring fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for my hand. And when Marcus stood up and spun me around, laughing with pure joy, I felt like the luckiest woman in Chicago. We called his parents immediately from a bench overlooking Lake Michigan, both of us giddy with excitement and talking over each other like teenagers. Richard answered on the first ring, and his reaction was everything I'd hoped for. "Congratulations, both of you. This is wonderful news. We're so happy for you." But when Victoria came on the line, Her first words after a perfectly timed pause were, "Well, I suppose we'll need to discuss the practical arrangements." The joy drained out of Marcus's face like someone had pulled a plug. "Mom, can we at least celebrate first?" "Of course, darling. But these things are important to handle properly. There are considerations when families merge, especially when there are different circumstances involved." Different circumstances. Code for the fact that I had nothing and they had everything, and they needed to make sure their everything stayed protected from my nothing. That night, after we had celebrated with champagne and called my father with the good news, Dad was thrilled, though I noticed he asked more questions about Marcus's character than his family's wealth. Victoria called me directly on my cell phone. "Aaliyah, dear," she said in that tone that made endearments sound like threats, "I hope you'll understand that this conversation isn't personal. It's simply that Marcus has worked tremendously hard to build his career and his financial position, and with your situation, well, we need to ensure that everyone's interests are properly protected. My situation." The words hung in the air like a slap. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Sterling." "A prenuptial agreement, dear. Completely standard in families like ours. I'm sure you understand the necessity." I understood perfectly. They saw me as a threat, a gold digger who couldn't possibly love Marcus for who he was rather than what he had. But I also understood that fighting this would only confirm their suspicions and create the kind of family drama that could destroy my relationship with Marcus before it really began. "Of course," I said, hating how small and defeated my voice sounded. "Wonderful. I'll have Harold schedule something for next week. He's handled Sterling family legal matters for decades. You'll find him very thorough." Very thorough. That should have been my first warning about what I was walking into. But what I didn't know was that the prenup appointment Victoria was scheduling wasn't just about protecting their wealth from me. It was about positioning themselves to take everything I had, including things I didn't even know I possessed. The prenup appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday at the Sterling family attorney's office, located on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper that seemed designed to make visitors feel insignificant. The elevator ride up felt endless, my stomach dropping with each floor as Marcus held my hand with fingers that were tense and sweaty. Harold Westbrook, Esquire, was exactly what Central Casting would order for intimidating family lawyer. Silver-haired, expensive suit, and an office with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more per month than my annual salary. The walls were lined with law degrees from prestigious universities and photographs of Harold, with various Chicago power brokers going back decades. "Please sit," Harold said, gesturing to two leather chairs positioned across from his massive mahogany desk like defendants facing a judge. "I've prepared the prenuptial agreement based on the Sterling family's standard requirements and Mrs. Sterling's specific instructions regarding this union. This union, not your marriage or your partnership, but a business transaction that needed to be properly managed." The contract was 37 pages of dense legal language that Harold explained with the kind of thorough precision usually reserved for reading someone their last rites. But the basic message was devastatingly simple. I would have no claim to anything Marcus owned, earned, or inherited, no matter how long we were married or what I contributed to our life together. "Section 3 outlines asset separation," Harold said, his voice professionally neutral. "Mr. Sterling's current assets, including his investment portfolio, his shares in Sterling and Associates, and his trust fund distributions, remain entirely separate property. Mrs. Parker would have no claim to these assets under any circumstances." I felt Marcus shift uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't speak. "Section 7 covers future earnings. Mr. Sterling's salary, bonuses, and any business income generated during the marriage remain his separate property. Mrs. Parker's teaching income, while modest, would similarly remain her separate property." The way Harold said "while modest" made it clear exactly how the Sterling family viewed my financial contribution to this marriage. Section 12 addresses spousal support in the event of divorce. Mrs. Parker would receive alimony payments of $2,000 per month for a maximum period of 24 months, provided the marriage lasted at least 2 years. $2,000 a month for 2 years. That wouldn't even cover rent on a decent apartment in Chicago, let alone rebuilding a life after a divorce. But the clause that made my stomach drop was Section 15. In the event that Mrs. Parker brings disrepute to the Sterling family name, damages their reputation in any way, or engages in behavior deemed inappropriate by the family's standards, all provisions of this agreement become null and void, and Mrs. Parker forfeits any claim to support or consideration. What exactly constitutes inappropriate behavior? I asked, finding my voice for the first time since we'd sat down. Harold consulted his notes. The family retains sole discretion in determining what actions might damage their reputation. This could include public disputes, social media posts, legal troubles, or association with individuals or organizations the family deems unsuitable. They were giving themselves the power to cut me off completely for any reason they chose at any time they chose. If I ever disagreed with them publicly, criticized their treatment of me, or failed to meet their undefined standards of appropriate behavior, I'd be left with absolutely nothing. This seems... I started, then caught myself. Saying it seemed unfair or one-sided would probably qualify as inappropriate behavior under their definition. It's quite standard, Harold said smoothly. Wealthy families must protect themselves from various potential complications. Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight. It's just a formality, Aaliyah. It doesn't mean anything. But it meant everything. It meant they saw me as a threat that needed to be contained, a gold digger who required legal barriers to prevent me from accessing what they'd built. It meant that in their minds I was exactly what they expected, a poor black woman looking for a financial upgrade through marriage. More than that, it meant Marcus was willing to sit silently while his family's lawyer explained exactly how powerless they intended to make me in my own marriage. I signed it anyway. I signed it with tears streaming down my face, while Victoria, who had appeared for the final formalities, watched with that satisfied smile that would haunt my dreams for months. She looked like someone who'd just won a game I hadn't even known we were playing. There now, she said, as Harold notarized the documents. That's all settled. Now we can focus on planning a beautiful wedding. As if humiliating me was just another item to check off the wedding planning list. But what Victoria Sterling didn't know was that 3 months later, one phone call would prove that she'd been playing chess while I held cards she couldn't even imagine. 3 months into our marriage, life had settled into a routine that felt both wonderful and suffocating, like being wrapped in silk that was slowly tightening around my throat. Marcus and I had moved into a gorgeous Lincoln Park townhouse that his parents had purchased as a wedding gift, though the deed was carefully placed in Marcus's name alone, exactly as the prenup required. The house was everything I'd never dared to dream of. 3 stories of exposed brick and hardwood floors, a kitchen with granite countertops and appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant, and windows that flooded every room with natural light. I had a home office where I could prepare lessons without papers scattered across our bed, and a backyard garden where I could grow the vegetables my grandmother had taught me to love. But even in this beautiful space, I felt like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. Marcus was loving but increasingly distant, working longer hours at Sterling and Associates and coming home exhausted from meetings and client dinners that seemed to multiply every week. When I suggested we start trying for a baby, he'd get this uncomfortable expression and change the subject. Let's just enjoy being married for a while, he'd say. But I suspected the real reason was that a baby would complicate the prenup, and his family wasn't ready for those complications. I'd also taken a position at Lincoln Park Academy, partly because Marcus had continued to gently pressure me about maximizing my potential, and partly because Victoria had made it clear that a Sterling family wife should teach a better class of children. The pay was indeed almost double what I'd made at Roosevelt Elementary, but I missed my old students desperately. At Lincoln Park, the children were polite and well prepared, their parents involved and supportive. But there was something missing. The raw joy of watching a kid who'd been told they were behind suddenly discover they could excel, the fierce pride in overcoming obstacles that my Roosevelt students had carried like armor. These Lincoln Park kids were privileged and comfortable, and while they deserved good teaching, they didn't need saving the way my old students had. I felt like I was using my skills to maintain advantages for children who already had every advantage, instead of creating opportunities for kids who had none. But whenever I mentioned missing Roosevelt Elementary, Marcus would get that patient expression he used when explaining complex financial concepts to clients. "You're making such a bigger impact now, though," he'd say. "These parents have connections, influence. The students you inspire here could end up changing the world, as if the students I'd taught at Roosevelt couldn't change the world, given the chance. The most telling indication of my status in this new life came during family dinners at the Sterling Mansion. Now that I was officially part of the family, I was included in all their gatherings, but I quickly learned that inclusion didn't mean acceptance. Victoria would ask about my work at Lincoln Park, with the kind of polite interest she might show in a neighbor's garden. Pleasant enough, but clearly not particularly important. When the conversation turned to family business, Marcus and Richard would discuss investment strategies and property deals, while Victoria shared updates about her various charity board positions. I was expected to listen politely and occasionally contribute observations about the younger generation or educational trends, but never to offer opinions about actual financial decisions or family direction. I was ornamental, not functional. The most painful moment came when Victoria mentioned a large donation the family was making to educational causes. "We've decided to endow a scholarship program at Northwestern," she announced over dessert. "Full tuition for deserving students from disadvantaged backgrounds." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased. "Have you considered partnering with specific high schools to identify candidates? I know some amazing students who—" "Oh, we have a selection committee that handles those details," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "Very qualified people who understand the proper criteria." Proper criteria. Not the messy, complicated reality of which kids actually needed help, but criteria that would ensure the scholarships went to students who would reflect well on the Sterling family name. I realized then that this was my role in their world, to be the acceptable face of their charitable impulses, the former inner-city teacher who proved their good intentions, but not someone whose actual experience or expertise was valued. That night, lying next to Marcus in our beautiful bedroom with its view of the Chicago skyline, I felt more alone than I had since my mother died. I was married to a man I loved, living in a house most people could only dream of, working at a prestigious school, accepted by a powerful family, and I was miserable, because none of it felt real. I felt like I was playing a role in someone else's life, pretending to be grateful for opportunities that required me to abandon everything that had made me who I was. But on Tuesday, October 15th, everything changed with a phone call that would reveal exactly how much I'd been underestimating my own worth. On Tuesday, October 15th, I was sitting in our sunlit kitchen grading papers from my Lincoln Park Academy students when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The caller ID showed Harrison, Mitchell and Associates, and for some reason, my heart started beating faster before I even answered. "Ms. Parker, this is James Harrison from Harrison, Mitchell and Associates. I was your father's attorney." The use of past tense made my blood go cold. Is something wrong with my dad? "Ms. Parker, I'm calling from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Your father collapsed at his office this morning with a massive heart attack. The doctors are doing everything they can, but you should come right away." The world tilted sideways. My father, David Parker, had been the one constant in my life since my mother died when I was 5. He was the man who'd worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat while never missing a single school play or parent-teacher conference. He'd walked me down the aisle 3 months ago with tears in his eyes, telling me he'd never been prouder of the woman I'd become. I called Marcus immediately, but he was in meetings all afternoon. I left a voicemail and drove to Northwestern Memorial alone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of beeping machines, hushed conversations with doctors, and the antiseptic smell of hospital corridors. Dad drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing me, sometimes staring at the ceiling like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Marcus arrived that first evening, bringing coffee and sandwiches I couldn't eat, rubbing my back when I cried. For those 3 days, he was the man I'd fallen in love with, present, supportive, genuinely sharing my pain. Victoria even called to offer condolences and any help the family could provide. On the 3rd day, Dad had a moment of clarity that felt like a gift. He squeezed my hand with strength I didn't know he still had, and looked at me with eyes that were completely lucid. "Baby girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machines keeping him alive. "When this is over, you need to go to First National Bank downtown, safety deposit box 1247. Everything you need to know is in there." His eyes were intense, urgent, like he was trying to communicate something much larger than just practical instructions. "Dad, you're going to be fine," I whispered back, but he shook his head with a sad smile. "No, sweetheart. But you're going to be more than fine. You're going to be free." His grip tightened. "Safety deposit box 1247. Promise me you'll go alone. Read everything before you talk to anyone else. Promise me." "I promise, Dad." He smiled then, a peaceful expression I'd remember forever. "I love you, baby girl, and I'm so proud of who you've become. You're stronger than you know." Dad died 2 hours later, holding my hand while machines flatlined around us. With him went the last person who'd ever loved me without conditions, without expectations, without wanting me to be anything other than exactly who I was. The funeral was small and simple, exactly how Dad would have wanted it. A handful of colleagues from his consulting work, neighbors from our old building, and the few teachers from Roosevelt Elementary who'd stayed in touch despite my move to Lincoln Park Academy. Marcus held me as I cried, and I felt grateful he was there, even though his presence couldn't fill the enormous hole Dad's death had left in my world. But throughout the entire service, Dad's urgent words kept echoing in my mind. "Safety deposit box 1247. Everything you need to know is in there." What could my father, who'd lived so modestly and worked so quietly, possibly have left that required such secrecy? A week later, when I opened that safety deposit box, I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and my own worth was about to be shattered and rebuilt. A week after Dad's funeral, Mr. Harrison called to schedule a meeting about the estate. I almost laughed when he used that word, estate. Dad had driven a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment on South Cottage Grove. What estate could there possibly be? But I kept my promise and went to First National Bank first, taking a personal day from Lincoln Park Academy. The bank was one of those imposing downtown buildings with marble columns and floors that echoed every footstep, designed to make you feel the weight of serious money even if you didn't have any. Safety deposit box 1247 was larger than I'd expected, and when the bank employee left me alone in the small viewing room, my hands were shaking as I turned the key. Inside were documents, photographs, and letters that made absolutely no sense at first glance. The first thing I saw was a newspaper clipping from 2003. "Local engineers' green energy patents revolutionize solar industry." The photo showed a younger version of my father, in a crisp suit, shaking hands with executives from 3 major energy companies I recognized from business news. I stared at the image for a full minute, convinced there was some mistake. This couldn't be my father, the man who wore the same 4 shirts to work and bought generic cereal to save $3 at the grocery store. But then I found more articles, each one more stunning than the last. Chicago inventor licenses revolutionary battery technology to global manufacturers. Patent portfolio generates massive royalty stream for local entrepreneur. Quiet genius behind clean energy. Breakthrough prefers to stay out of spotlight. There were technical documents showing patent applications for solar cell efficiency improvements and battery storage systems that I couldn't begin to understand. Stock certificates for companies I'd never heard of. Bank statements showing monthly deposits that made my teaching salary look like pocket change. And photographs, so many photographs of Dad at industry conferences, patent ceremonies, and environmental summits. Pictures of him with people I recognized from Forbes magazine covers and Wall Street Journal articles. My father, my quiet, humble father, who'd raised me alone while working what I thought was some boring office job, had apparently been hobnobbing with the most powerful people in the clean energy industry. The most shocking document was a portfolio summary from Millfield Wealth Management, dated just 6 months before Dad's death. According to this report, David Parker's renewable energy patents were generating over $40 million annually in licensing fees from companies around the world. His investment portfolio, built from years of royalty income, was worth an additional $1 billion. My father was worth $3 billion. I had to read that number 3 times before it sank in. My father, who'd clipped coupons and driven an old Honda and lived in a studio apartment smaller than my current walk-in closet, was worth more than $2 billion. The letter that explained everything was in Dad's careful handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Aliyah, if you're reading this, then my time protecting you is over, and yours begins. I know this must be overwhelming, but please read everything before you react. I created those energy patterns because I believe technology should help heal our planet, not just generate profit for a few people. When the licensing money started flowing in during the mid-2000s, I faced a choice: live like a billionaire and raise my daughter in that world, or use the money responsibly while keeping both of us grounded in reality. I chose to live modestly and give you a normal childhood, free from the complications and dangers that come with this kind of wealth. But I also made this choice for your safety, baby girl. When you become this wealthy, especially as a black man in America, you attract attention, not all of it good. I received threats, extortion attempts, people who wanted to hurt me through the person I loved most, you. So I became David Parker, the consultant, living paycheck to paycheck, driving an old car, keeping you safe by keeping our real situation hidden. Every month, 80% of the royalty income went to scholarships for kids like you, environmental research and educational programs in underserved communities. The money in these accounts represents years of careful investment and conservative living, but it's grown into something that can change not just your life, but thousands of lives. Now you're old enough and strong enough to handle this responsibility. Use it wisely, sweetheart. Use it to make the difference I always knew you would make. And remember, your worth has never had anything to do with this money. You were extraordinary long before you knew any of this existed. All my love, Dad. P.S. I've been having you followed and protected by a security team since you were 16. They're very good at staying invisible, but they're always there. When you're ready to meet them, call the number on the business card in envelope number 3. I sat in that bank vault for 3 hours, reading every document, looking at every photograph, trying to process the complete transformation of everything I thought I knew about my life. My father had been secretly funding educational programs across Chicago, supporting renewable energy research around the world, and donating to environmental causes, all while making sure I never felt different or special because of money he wanted me to earn the right to handle. When I finally gathered the documents and prepared to leave, I was laughing and crying at the same time. Not just because of the money, though $3 billion was certainly life-changing, but because of what this revealed about my father's love and sacrifice. He'd given up a billionaire's lifestyle to give me something more valuable, the knowledge that I could succeed on my own merit, that my achievements belonged to me, and that my worth as a person had nothing to do with my bank account. But as I drove home to tell Marcus about my inheritance, I realized this discovery was about to reveal something equally important about the Sterling family, and what I learned would destroy everything I thought I knew about love, marriage, and who had really needed protection all along. That night, I sat Marcus down in our living room and told him my father had died with significantly more assets than we'd realized. I didn't reveal the full truth, not even close, but I shared enough to test his reaction, to see what kind of man I'd actually married. "How much more?" he asked, and I caught something in his voice that made my stomach tighten. Not concern for my emotional state, not questions about how I was processing this revelation about my father's secret life, but immediate curiosity about numbers and financial implications. "Enough that I'll need to take extended time off to handle the estate," I said carefully, watching his face. "There are multiple investment accounts, some patent royalties I didn't know about, and complex tax situations that require professional management." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharpening with interest. "Patent royalties? What kind of patents?" "Green energy technology, solar panel efficiency improvements, and battery storage systems from the early 2000s. "Aaliyah, that could be serious money," he said, and the way he emphasized serious made me feel slightly sick. The renewable energy boom over the past decade has been huge for early patent holders. Some of those licensing deals are worth millions annually. Not how overwhelming this must be for you, or "I'm sorry your father carried this burden alone." Just calculations about profit potential and what this might mean for our lifestyle. "I'm meeting with his wealth management team next week to understand the full scope," I said. "I should come with you," Marcus said immediately. "My family's financial advisors could help coordinate everything. We should probably involve Sterling and Associates in the portfolio management. They have connections with all the major investment houses. Marcus was already inserting himself and his family into my inheritance. Despite the prenup that explicitly separated our finances and gave me no claim to sterling family wealth. That's thoughtful, I said, but Dad's existing team seems to have everything well organized. I want to understand what he built before making any major changes. Marcus looked slightly disappointed, but he nodded. Of course. Just remember that managing this kind of wealth requires expertise. We want to make sure you're getting the best possible advice. The next Sunday dinner with the Sterling family was absolutely enlightening. I casually mentioned that I'd discovered Dad had some family assets I hadn't been aware of, and the transformation in their behavior was immediate and nauseating. Victoria, who had barely tolerated my presence for 18 months, suddenly became intensely interested in my well-being. "Oh, my dear, how overwhelming this must be for you," she said with what I'm sure she thought was genuine sympathy. "Managing inherited wealth requires such specialized knowledge. I hope you're getting proper guidance." "What sort of assets are we talking about?" Richard asked with the kind of casual directness that suggested he'd been wondering about this all evening. "Some technology patents that generate licensing income. I'm still learning the details." Victoria's eyebrows raised in what looked like carefully controlled excitement. "How interesting. Patent law can be quite lucrative, especially in emerging industries." Richard was more direct. "If you need recommendations for intellectual property attorneys or wealth management firms, we know several excellent options. This kind of income stream requires very specific expertise to maximize value and minimize tax exposure." But it was Marcus's sister Stephanie who revealed the most about the Sterling family's true nature. After barely speaking to me for the entire year and a half I'd known them, she suddenly appeared at my elbow after dinner, with a warm smile and genuine interest in developing our relationship. "Aaliyah, we should definitely do lunch sometime soon," she said, touching my arm with newfound affection. "I feel terrible that we haven't gotten to know each other better. Family is so important, don't you think?" Family. After 18 months of polite distance and subtle condescension, I was suddenly family the moment I hinted at having assets worth protecting. Over the next week, I dropped more hints to test their reactions further. I mentioned needing to meet with investment advisors and having to understand royalty distribution structures. Each hint was met with increasing offers of help, suggestions for Sterling family financial consultants, and invitations to family business discussions I'd never been included in before. Victoria called me directly on Wednesday evening. "Aaliyah, darling, I've been thinking about your father's patent portfolio. Richard has extensive connections in the intellectual property world that could be tremendously helpful. We're family now. Our resources are your resources. Our resources are your resources." After a prenup designed to ensure their resources would never be my resources, this statement was breathtaking in its hypocrisy. The most telling moment came when Marcus suggested we start looking at larger houses. "With your inheritance and my income, we could afford something really spectacular," he said, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on his laptop. "Maybe something in Kenwood, or even one of those new developments in the Gold Coast. Your inheritance and my income." Despite the prenup that legally separated our assets, Marcus was already mentally combining my money with his lifestyle plans. I smiled and nodded, playing the role of grateful wife receiving helpful guidance from her financially sophisticated husband and his generous family. But inside I was taking careful notes about who these people really were when they thought I had something they wanted, but they still had no idea what they were really dealing with. What I planned to reveal next would show the Sterling family exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman they'd tried to contain. The following Sunday, I decided it was time for the Sterling family to get their first real taste of what they were dealing with. I'd spent the week in meetings with Dad's wealth management team, learning the intricate details of his financial empire and preparing for this moment. I arrived at dinner with a leather portfolio, nothing too dramatic, just professional enough to suggest I was handling serious business. Throughout the meal, Victoria kept glancing at it with barely concealed curiosity, like a cat watching a mouse that might be hiding something interesting. "How are you managing with all the estate complexities, dear?" she finally asked as we finished our main course, her voice dripping with what she probably thought was motherly concern. "It's been more overwhelming than I expected," I said honestly. "I had no idea Dad was involved in so many different business ventures." Ventures. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I could see the dollar signs lighting up behind his eyes. "The patent licensing alone is far more complicated than I imagined. 23 different companies, across 6 countries currently pay royalties for his various green energy innovations. 23 companies. Marcus's voice was sharp with surprise, and I noticed his hand had stopped moving entirely. I opened the portfolio with deliberate casualness and pulled out a single bank statement, carefully selected to show enough to shock them without revealing the full scope of what I'd inherited. The document showed royalty payments for September, $7 million deposited from various energy companies around the world. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Victoria's wineglass stopped halfway to her lips, frozen in mid-air like she'd been turned to stone. Richard actually choked on his water, coughing and reaching for his napkin. Marcus just stared at the numbers with his mouth slightly open, his usual financial sophistication temporarily short-circuited. Stephanie, who had been scrolling through her phone during most of dinner, looked up and whispered, Is that just 1 month? According to the wealth management team, September was actually slightly below average, I said with the kind of casual tone people use to discuss grocery shopping. Apparently, solar royalties peak during the summer quarters, when energy production is highest. Victoria's face had gone completely white, and I could practically see her mental calculator working overtime. If this was 1 month, and it was below average, what was the annual income? What was the total portfolio value? Aaliyah, Richard said carefully, his voice slightly hoarse from the water incident, have you considered the tax implications of this level of income? Estate taxes alone could be... Dad's team has been handling all the tax optimization for years, I interrupted smoothly. Apparently he had some very sophisticated structures in place. International licensing agreements, charitable giving strategies, investment vehicles I'm still learning about. Marcus reached across the table and grabbed my free hand, but his touch felt different now. Not comforting, but possessive, like he was staking a claim on something that had suddenly become much more valuable. Babe, this is incredible, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I was starting to recognize as greed. We should definitely get Sterling and Associates involved in managing this. They handle portfolios at this scale all the time. We are, despite the prenup that explicitly prevented me from claiming any Sterling family assets, my inheritance had somehow become community property in Marcus's mind. That's generous, I said, but Dad's existing team seems to have everything running smoothly. His wealth manager said making sudden changes could be disruptive to established income streams. Victoria leaned forward, her earlier shock replaced by the kind of hungry interest I'd seen her display at charity auctions when she was bidding on something she absolutely had to have. Aaliyah, darling, she said, her voice now warm with an affection that felt about as genuine as a $3 bill. I hope you know that as a Sterling, you're part of our family's legacy now. We take care of our own, and we have resources that could be tremendously helpful. As a Sterling, after 18 months of making me feel like an outsider who'd won some kind of marriage lottery, I was suddenly an essential member of the family legacy. The important thing, Richard added, is making sure you're getting the best possible advice. This level of wealth requires very specialized management. And protection, Victoria said meaningfully. There are people who might try to take advantage of someone who's new to handling significant assets. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife. The people most likely to take advantage of my significant assets were sitting right at this table, offering to help me protect myself from exactly the kind of predatory behavior they were demonstrating. When we left that evening, Victoria walked me to the car with her arm linked through mine in a display of solidarity she'd never shown before. Aaliyah, I hope you'll forgive me if I seemed overly protective when you and Marcus first began dating, she said, with what I'm sure she thought was a touching admission of maternal vulnerability. A mother worries about people who might have the wrong intentions, but I can see now that you come from the sort of family that understands responsibility and proper financial stewardship. The sort of family that has money, she meant. Nothing about my character had changed, nothing about my love for Marcus or my values or my integrity, but my bank account had magically transformed me from a threat into an asset. But the $7 million they'd just seen was barely 1% of the truth, and when I revealed the real numbers, the Sterling family wouldn't just be shocked, they'd be terrified. The transformation in the Sterling family's behavior over the next 2 weeks was so dramatic, it would have been comical if it wasn't so nauseating. Suddenly I was invited to every family business meeting, every charity board discussion, and every social event I'd been politely excluded from for 18 months. Victoria started calling me twice a week with ideas for managing my inheritance, each conversation more presumptuous than the last. She suggested I needed a family office to coordinate my various assets, recommended specific investment strategies, and even hinted that I should consider establishing a foundation that could work in partnership with Sterling family charitable initiatives. But it was Marcus's behavior that disturbed me most. He'd become obsessed with my finances in a way that felt predatory rather than supportive. Every conversation somehow circled back to investment opportunities, tax strategies, or ways we could optimize our combined resources. When I reminded him that our resources weren't actually combined according to the prenup he'd watched me sign, he'd wave his hand dismissively. "That old thing? We can tear it up any time we want. We're married now. What's yours is mine and what's mine is yours." Except I'd never been entitled to what was his, thanks to that same prenup that was suddenly so dismissible. The most revealing moment came when Victoria invited me to lunch at the Chicago Club, the exclusive downtown establishment where she conducted her most important social business. The dining room was all crystal chandeliers and oil paintings, filled with women who looked exactly like her and wielded the same kind of quiet power. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said after we'd ordered, leaning forward with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy she'd never shown me before. "And I'm concerned you might not be getting the protection you need." "Protection from what?" "Well, darling, there are people who might challenge your inheritance. Distant relatives your father never mentioned, business partners who feel entitled to a share of his innovations, even government agencies that might question some of his tax strategies." My blood went cold, but not for the reason Victoria expected. "Are you suggesting someone might try to take my inheritance?" "I'm suggesting we need to be proactive about protecting it," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd probably used on the federal bench. "Richard knows attorneys who specialize in estate defense. We could help you establish some protective structures, family trusts, offshore accounts, legal barriers that would make any challenge virtually impossible. Family trusts controlled by Sterling family attorneys. Protective structures that would conveniently require Sterling family oversight. Victoria Sterling wasn't trying to help me protect my money, she was trying to get legal control of it. These challenges often come very quickly after someone inherits significant wealth, she continued. We should probably move fast to establish proper protections before anyone else becomes aware of your situation. The threat was clear. Let us control your money voluntarily, or we'll find ways to tie it up in legal challenges that could last for years. That's very thoughtful of you to be concerned, I managed. Family takes care of family, Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and we've certainly learned that you're much more substantial than we initially realized. That evening I called Detective Maria Santos, a private investigator who specialized in corporate due diligence. If Victoria Sterling wanted to play games with my inheritance, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I want to know everything about Sterling and Associates and the Sterling family finances, I told her. Income, debts, legal troubles, anything that might motivate them to go after someone else's assets. What Detective Santos discovered over the next week was absolutely stunning and explained everything about the Sterling family's sudden interest in my well-being. Sterling and Associates was in serious financial trouble. Richard's real estate empire had been devastated by rising interest rates and several major commercial projects that had gone catastrophically over budget. They'd been quietly selling off properties and liquidating investments for the past 8 months, trying to stay ahead of mounting debts. But the real shock was Marcus's personal financial situation. My husband, the successful investment banker who'd swept me off my feet with his BMW and expensive suits, was drowning in debt. Gambling debts from high-stakes poker games, bad investment decisions he'd hidden from his family, personal loans that were coming due with interest rates that could bankrupt him. Marcus Sterling wasn't just broke. He was desperate, and he'd been desperate long before he met me. "There's something else," Detective Santos said when she called with her final report. "Victoria Sterling has been meeting with a litigation attorney who specializes in challenging inheritance distributions. 3 times in the past 2 weeks. The prenup suddenly made perfect sense in a way that made me feel sick to my stomach. It wasn't just about protecting Sterling family wealth from me. It was about positioning themselves to access my wealth when the opportunity arose. They'd known. Somehow they'd known that my father had money, and they'd been planning this con from the very beginning, but they'd made one critical mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed I was still the naive teacher who'd signed that prenup with tears in her eyes, someone they could manipulate with legal threats and family pressure. They had no idea who they were really dealing with, because what I was about to reveal wouldn't just shock the Sterling family, it would destroy every assumption they'd made about power, money, and who really needed protection in this relationship. I decided to end this charade at the next family dinner, but not the way Victoria Sterling was expecting. I arrived with Mr. Harrison, Detective Santos, and a briefcase containing the complete truth about my inheritance, along with some additional information about the Sterling family that I was certain they'd find illuminating. "Aaliyah," Victoria said as she noticed my entourage, her voice slightly strained. "What's all this about?" I thought it was time we all had a completely honest conversation about money, family, and protection, I said, settling into my chair at their elegant dining room table. "Since you've all been so concerned about my financial well-being." Richard looked nervous. Marcus was sweating despite the October chill, but Victoria maintained her composure, probably assuming this was about legal formalities or tax documentation. "Of course, dear. We just want to ensure you're properly protected." "I am," I said, nodding to Mr. Harrison. "Mr. Harrison has been managing my father's business empire for over 20 years. He's handled every aspect of Dad's financial life, including some things I'm sure you'll find very interesting." I opened the briefcase and pulled out the complete financial portfolio. I think I may have understated the scope of my father's assets. The document I placed on the table was a comprehensive wealth summary prepared by Millfield Wealth Management. It showed annual royalty income of $47 million, investment portfolios worth $1 billion, and a net worth that placed David Parker among the wealthiest individuals in Illinois. Victoria's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Richard made a choking sound that wasn't quite human. Marcus just stared at the numbers like they were written in a language he couldn't comprehend. $2.3 billion, Stephanie whispered, reading the bottom line. "You're worth $2.3 billion. Actually, it's closer to $2.4 billion now," I said casually. October was a good month for solar energy production, but I wasn't finished. Detective Santos has prepared some additional information that I thought might interest everyone, I continued, pulling out another set of documents. "Since we're having such an honest conversation about financial situations, the Sterling family financial summary made for fascinating reading. Richard's commercial real estate empire was hemorrhaging money, with over $200 million in debt coming due in the next 18 months. Sterling and Associates had been losing clients steadily, with several major accounts pulling their investments due to poor performance. And Marcus, my dear husband Marcus, owed $7 million to various creditors, including some very unpleasant people who didn't typically accept payment plans. The most interesting discovery," I said, looking directly at Victoria, "was your recent consultation with Williams and Associates about challenging inheritance distributions. Apparently, you've been exploring legal strategies for contesting my father's estate." Victoria's face went from white to gray. "Aaliyah, I can explain—" "Oh, there's no need to explain," I interrupted, because Detective Santos also found something else. My father had a security team that investigated anyone who got close to our family. They've been watching all of you since Marcus and I started dating seriously. I pulled out a thick folder of surveillance reports, financial investigations, and background checks that painted a devastating picture of Sterling family desperation and Marcus's hidden gambling addiction. They knew about your financial troubles, Marcus's debts, and your family's history of using legal intimidation to acquire assets from people who married into families you considered beneath your standards. The silence in that room was absolutely deafening. "But here's what I find most fascinating," I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "The prenup you insisted I sign, the one designed to protect your wealth from me, actually positioned you perfectly to access mine. No claim to Sterling assets, but full legal standing to influence financial decisions as my husband." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. "Fortunately, my father was much smarter than any of you realized. Every dollar of my inheritance is held in irrevocable trusts with very specific management requirements. Neither my husband nor his family can access, influence, or redirect those funds in any way. Victoria finally found her voice. Aaliyah, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, I said, standing up. I understand that you saw a poor black teacher and assumed I was exactly what you expected. Someone you could manipulate, control, and ultimately exploit. I looked directly at Marcus, feeling my heart break one final time for the man I'd thought I loved. I also understand that you never loved me, Marcus. You loved the idea of rescuing me, of being my savior. But when I no longer needed saving, you started seeing me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. I gathered my documents and prepared to leave. The prenup stays in place, I announced. Not because I'm bitter, but because it's perfect protection. It keeps me from claiming anything that belongs to you, and it keeps you from accessing anything that belongs to me. 3 years later, I established the David Parker Foundation, focusing on educational opportunities and renewable energy initiatives in underserved communities. I still teach, though now at a school I built that gives kids like my old Roosevelt Elementary students access to the kind of resources and opportunities every child deserves. I met someone new, Dr. Samuel Washington, a pediatrician who knew nothing about my money when he fell in love with my laugh at a community health fair. He's someone who sees my worth in how I treat his patients' families, not in my investment portfolio. My father's greatest gift wasn't the money he left me. It was the lesson that true wealth comes from knowing your value has nothing to do with your bank account. The Sterling family's prenup was supposed to protect them from me, but it ended up protecting me from people who could never see past a balance sheet to recognize someone's real worth. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is show you exactly who they are. That prenup was the most expensive education I never had to pay for, and every humiliating clause was worth learning the truth about people who measure love in dollars and consider character a secondary asset. Thank you to everyone who typed respect, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, remember, your worth is determined by who you are, not what you have.